Hello, welcome to COM 222, Intercultural Communications. Today we're going to be discussing Israeli, Palestine, and Mexican cultural communication. So before we get into the actual evolution of communication, we have to understand where it began, and that's when man started creating symbols that represented reality. This led to the development of language and communication, as each symbol evolved into symbolic sound that had specific meanings. So if you look over on the right, what you'll see at the top are Egyptian hieroglyphics that are about 4,000 or 5,000 years old. And some things you might recognize. You'll see a sun, a boat, um, birds. Those all represented something. Below that is ancient Greek, and that, again, you'll see letters that are very similar to what we would see today, like the E's and the N's and the P's. But again, this was an early form of writing which allowed for long distance communication. So every culture in the world generates, receives, stores, retrieves, and manipulates symbols that stand for something else, especially words. When we call a dog, we have an image or symbol in our mind of a furry friend with 4 legs. Why do we call it a dog? Because our culture has agreed to call it that. When you go to France, the symbol is now called a chien. So, language is a culturally accepted decision of what words we're going to use to identify certain things or actions. A culture's use of verbal and nonverbal language involves not only words, but also forms of reasoning. In other words, how speech is performed, specialized linguistic devices such as analogies and idioms, the use of time and space, unique ways of moving, and behaviors that display emotions. We're going to talk about the culture of language, and we begin by pointing out 3 important principles regarding language. Number 1, language, verbal or nonverbal, is a set of symbols, otherwise known as vocabulary, that evoke more or less uniform meanings among a particular population and a set of rules, i.e., grammar and syntax, for using those symbols. Verbal and nonverbal meanings are learned as part of a person's cultural affiliation. And number 3, the meanings people give to symbols reside within each individual. So, for example, you would have somebody make a peace sign, the 2 fingers up in the air like that, and that could mean peace. The person is intending it to mean peace. Other eras, we saw that sign become V for victory during a wartime era. And now in England, if you use that V in a certain very specific way, it's a good job of saying F you to somebody. When you communicate verbally with members of your own culture, you use words with ease because there is a learned agreement among the communicators about the meanings the words bring to mind. So when I say cat, you're thinking of a 4-legged animal with a tail and, furry, and it's small, 10 pounds, that kind of thing. So we agree on the terms we use to identify things. When cultural diversity is added to the process of decoding words, a much larger range of meanings and usage is found. So what is symbolized and what do the symbols represent are very much a function of culture. How symbols are used is also rooted in each member of a specific culture. This relationship between language and culture is not unidirectional. Rather, they influence each other. And finally, what you think about and how you express your thoughts is also rooted in your culture. Some cultures are very expressive, other cultures are very restrained. In many ways, nonverbal communication is even more complicated than verbal interaction. Nonverbal interaction or communication can be problematic in two ways. Number one, nonverbal communication is often unconscious and unclear. In most instances, we use nonverbal symbols without thinking about our posture, the gestures we use, or even what personal distance is appropriate for each situation. Much of nonverbal communication is automatic. And the second problem is interpreting nonverbal communication is usually an educated guess. You notice two people talking and one has a clenched fist. You must decide if they are about to get into a fight or expressing emotion over something that has just happened. Even perceiving someone in tears can produce a variety of responses. Successful intercultural communication requires that you recognize and understand culture's influence on both verbal and nonverbal interaction. And you might be saying, oh my God, there's so many different cultures out there. How can I possibly learn all of this? Well, what we're really trying to do here is teach you to know that these differences will exist. So if you get the opportunity to work in a country like Japan or a country like France, that there's going to be some serious cultural differences that you need to learn about in order to assimilate into their environment. Language, communication, and culture are intricately intertwined with one another. Language is a symbolic system in which meaning is shared among people who identify with one another. Both verbal and nonverbal aspects of language exist. Spoken language is a vehicle for people to communicate in social interaction by expressing their experience and creating experience. Communication cannot exist without language, and language needs the process of communication to engage people in social interaction. And we know, based on psychology and lifespan development, that social interaction is how we learn our culture. And more importantly, it's how we grow as individuals within a culture. So both language and communication reflect culture. And culture is a social system in which members share common standards of communication, behaving, and evaluating in everyday life. Culture includes how individuals organize and share rules for creation and interpretation of behavior. Language and communication represent an individual's symbolic organization of the world. And language and communication enable people to express themselves while simultaneously being controlled to conform to shared cultural standards. So, if you look at modern American culture in the 21st century, you can see that certain words have been added to the dictionary, usually related to internet use. The word Google is now being used as a verb instead of a noun. So go Google that. These are all things that have occurred through culture. There isn't some, you know, person who lives on a hill who says, no, this is a new word and we're going to use it. It's actually culture who decides that. Moving on to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This was the first modern research of the relationship between language and culture. This idea proposes a view that language structure is necessary in order to produce thought, so that grammar, sentence structure, vocabulary. Simply stated, language influences and shapes how people perceive their world and their culture. Diversity in language and structure lead to cultural differences in thought and perceptions of the world. This position is known as linguistic relativity. Sapir believes that the real world is largely built on the unconscious language habits of the group. People who speak different languages segment their world differently. And here's just an absolutely ridiculous joke. You have to be really someone deep in the world of linguists to get this. How do you pick up a linguist at a bar? Hey, if I told you that you have a beautiful body according to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, it's probably the structure of my language has affected the way I perceive aesthetic standards. Again, I warned you, it's a joke only really for linguists. The point being is we perceive things oftentimes because of the way culture has determined how language will be used. In the Chinese culture, there is an aspect of our physical health that is viewed in terms of either yi-ha, which is heat, or liang, which is cool, which are extreme conditions that may be balanced through various types of foods and herbs. This is an example of Chinese reality of framing and screening what these cultural members pay attention to. On the other hand, the American reality promotes eating a well-balanced diet from the four main food groups: fruits and veggies, meat and poultry, bread and grains, and dairy products. The American reality does not categorize food as warm or cold in nature and understanding, but maintaining a balanced diet is how to help one's health. So it's a different reality. So the Chinese are going to look at things that are hot and cold, and the Americans are going to look at things of what food group they fit into. This cultural process of thinking and perceiving influences how members may communicate by accepting or rejecting particular foods, medicines, and procedures in certain circumstances. A person who is not familiar with another person's cultural ways will be likely to misinterpret the person's actions. So, to discuss this in context of a geopolitical situation, we're going to look at Israeli and Palestinians and how they both lay claim to the same land. So, throughout the 20th century, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have been engaged in political conflicts that often became violent. At the end of the 1800s, Zionists sought to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, the ancestral land of the Jewish people. So, this is where they originally came out of. This is where Jews who had emigrated to different parts of Europe and Russia wanted to return to so that they would have their place, which historically had belonged to them. However, at the same time, on the same land, the Palestinian Arabs lived, and this resulted in a clash between Jewish and Palestinian communities over the ownership of the land, the right for self-determination, and statehood. So, in a sense, it would be like if the Native Americans took a group such as, for example, Wyoming, the entire state of Wyoming, to court, demanding that they be given the right to return to Wyoming as their native land, and the court saying, yes, all Native Americans can now live in Wyoming. That's their place, and anyone who's currently living there has to leave. So you would have all these white people and African American people and Hispanic people and Asian people who would be forced to leave. And of course, for the American Indians, that would be totally fine with in many cases because they dealt with a lot of terrible things. On the other side, all the people who have lived there for 100 years and have established, they are also extremely upset. So there is no, you know, this person is wrong or that person is right. Violence between the two communities first erupted in the 1920s and has pervaded the relationship in various forms and varying degrees of intensity since that time. In 1947, the United Nations declared a partition of Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, which became known as Israel. Many Palestinians who lived in the portion of Palestine that became Israel were dispersed to neighboring Arab countries, having been expelled by the Israeli forces. So, although the conflict centers on the issue of land, it's really who has the legitimate rights to the land. And it's a cultural conflict because now we're having a conflict over identity and how one is recognized with their identity. Now, keep in mind that from the mid 1930s to 1945, Adolf Hitler in Germany did his best to try and eliminate Jews. So, at that time period, in the 1945-46 era, people really saw that the Jews were being fundamentally discriminated against and needed international help to establish themselves as a valued participant in the world economy. So, we're looking at many different things here, not just the land, but we're talking about culture, we're talking about communication, and this leads to the differences between Israeli Jews and Palestinians involving, the negative stereotypes, saying terrible things about each other, miscommunicating. All of these things have created what's essentially become a 60-year disagreement that is always on the precipice of war. Dialogue sessions between Israeli Jews and Palestinians involve a process of transformative communication aimed at improving the relations between the sides. Transformative dialogue between cultural groups in conflict helps reduce prejudice and hostility and foster mutual understanding. In sociology, this is based on social interaction theory and the contact hypothesis. The contact hypothesis states that under certain conditions, contact between groups who are in conflict reduces prejudice and changes negative intergroup attitudes. The contact hypothesis is optimal under certain conditions. So, first, the concept of dialogue is the general guiding principle of these groups. The goal of communication is to avoid a monologue or the pressure of a single authoritative voice and to strive for a dialogue which emphasizes the interplay of different perspectives where something new and unique emerges. At its best, dialogue is a search for deep differences and shared concerns. It asks participants to inquire genuinely about the other person and avoid premature judgment, debate, and questions designed to expose flaws. The process of change and transformation during dialogue is difficult, complex, and slow. There is simply no possibility for reconciliation and peace without sustained interaction. So, when your mom made you and your brother make up and, talk it out, she is following this concept of transformative dialogue. We're also going to look at speech codes, which we all have in terms of the subcultures we belong to. So, members of cultural communities share principles of language use and interpretation. This simply means that your use of language, meaning word choice, slang, accents, and syntax, and the way you tend to interpret and understand this language in a certain way depends on your cultural membership. For example, assume you overheard the following conversation. Jesse, yeah, I'm thinking about getting some new ink. Jean, really? Where are you going to put it? Jesse, oh, I don't know. I still got some clean spots. Well, this is about two men or a man and a woman discussing whether or not to get a tattoo. They never say the words, but they have that ink as a code, clean spaces as a code. Those are the things. So you can only understand and participate in the conversation if you understand the code. Returning to the previous example of Israeli Jewish and Arab cultures that have emerged from very different historical circumstances, and consequently different norms of communication emerge as well. These contrasting speech codes can make communication difficult. So they're literally right next door to each other, and they have such a different culture that communicating at its very core is a challenge. Several researchers have described an Arab communication code called Musaira, which means to accommodate or to go along with. An Arab speaker who is engaging in the code of Musara is being polite, indirect, courteous, and not confrontational to the other members of a conversation. The speech code of Israeli Jews is in sharp contrast to Musaira. Israeli Jews employ a direct, pragmatic, and assertive style. This style has been called Dugri by Catriel. Dugri means straight talk, and it is a well-documented code used by Israeli Jews. And it is the opposite of Musaira. Dugri speech is to the point, with the communication of understanding and information as the most important communicative goals. Dugri and Musara are excellent examples of speech codes. We can see how these ideas are powerfully ingrained in the communication of cultural members and are often responsible for misunderstanding and problems in intercultural communication. Speech codes are identified with a specific people in a specific place. When you first listen to someone speak, you often ask or wonder, where are you from? Where are they from? Language is usually identified with locations such as countries, regions, or neighborhoods. Israeli Dugri speech is associated with native-born Israelis of Jewish heritage in the land of Israel. The code is unique to Jews primarily of European heritage, as opposed to Jews of African heritage, and the code became crystallized in the pre-state period of the 1930s and 40s during a time of significant anti-Jewish sentiment in Europe. So, as a response to all of the discrimination and prejudice that Jews were experiencing in Germany and other places in Europe, they became a much more forthright and assertive group of people. Musaira is culturally distinct for speakers of Arabic and members of Arabic cultures. However, its geographic location is more complex than Dugri because Arabic cultures are more geographically diverse. So whether you're in Iran, Iraq, Libya, Turkey, these countries have a sense of Arabic culture, but it's not the same kind of culture. And a lot of people in Turkey don't even accept that they're part of the Middle East. They say they're more on the European side. So even within that context, there are a lot of cultural differences. In both cases, however, when speakers of a code change geographic locations, they modify their code use. Speech codes are intimately connected to the psychological qualities of a culture. They are related to how people see themselves. A Musara code is maintaining consistency with a culture's expectations of honor. To use Musara is to maintain honor and express a distinct psychology of being Arabic. Israeli Jews, on the other hand, use Dugri to express their strong native identity. Historically, Jews were an oppressed people, but the establishment of the State of Israel altered this historical condition. Dugri speech is a communicative expression of this pride. The meaning and significance of messages fundamentally depend on the codes. There is an old saying, meanings are in people, not words. So when you say, I love him, does that mean you want to marry him, or that you think he's really funny, or that you really like who he is as a person? This means that true understanding of a communication depends on the people speaking and the code they use. When people communicate, they are performing some type of action, and the other person interprets that action, and that interpretation relies on their knowledge of speech codes. Speech codes are on display in the language of others. They are observable in the communication of cultural members. Speech codes are also found in the ritualized functions of communication. These are the known and repeated ways of organizing interaction, and they have code-specific symbolic forms. By studying these symbolic forms and communication patterns, we can discover how the cultural world is orderly rather than chaotic. Speech codes can be used to understand, predict, and control communication. The understanding and use of speech codes can be used to improve communication. Even if they are steeped in cultural codes, they often adapt their code and alter typical patterns when communicating with a non-native. This means there is potential for change and opportunities to avoid the more troublesome aspects of codes. And additionally, situations will absolutely alter speech codes. So let's get back to the communication issues between Israeli Jews and the Palestinians. Between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, argument is important because at least it is an acceptable mechanism of conflict resolution. The world would rather have these two groups argue than shoot at each other. And, to a large extent, it's because if you have a country, for example, Israel, that has a nuclear bomb, and they bomb Palestine, well, then you have a country that is Muslim, such as Pakistan, who is rumored to have a nuclear weapon, who can then retaliate to Israel, and then the United States gets involved, Russia gets involved, and we could end up with mutually assured nuclear annihilation. So we don't want that. Status, on the other hand, is one of the problems for groups in a dialogue situation. When cultural groups are different in status, the argument produced by the high status groups can carry more weight. Israeli Jews, given their military and economic advantages, carry considerably more status in dialogues. Moreover, their speech codes are more conducive to an argument. So, in case you are not aware of this, in Israel, everybody, man and woman, has to serve 1 to 2 years in the military. It's mandatory service. So obviously they're going to have a pretty strong military. In studies by Ellis and Moaz, researchers found that arguments during political dialogues between Israeli Jews and Palestinians were not necessarily consistent with expectations from cultural speech codes. In other words, the Israeli Jews do not necessarily use more assertive arguments, and the Arabs are not necessarily less overtly aggressive. It appears that the context of the dialogue, the circumstances of the dialogue, does alter speech codes and provides an environment for more equal status discussion. The dialogue context helps transform the indigenous code of each group. This is an important matter with respect to the power relationship between each group. It suggests that speech codes are pliant and that situations and activities can be found that reduce the cultural strength of these codes and make change and growth more possible. These communication experiences balance the relationship between hostile and unequal groups in order to promote egalitarianism and make future interactions more productive. So, dialogue groups that work to promote open discussion and equal relations can help lessen status differences. Now, interestingly, in the United States, we are more concerned about race than status necessarily. But in England, especially, status, whether you are of the upper crust, the middle class, the lower classes, the working class, is how people are generally categorized and discriminated against. And this little cartoon here is a perfect explanation of that. So in England, the expectation is that you're going to be very proper and that you're going to go out of your way to show that you have a superior level of status. So guy walking his dog, guy is in the river yelling help, and the guy doesn't help. But if he says it the correct way, and again, this is British, "Excuse me, sir, I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but I wonder if you would mind helping me a moment, as long as it's no trouble, of course." Now, this may seem ridiculous to someone who doesn't come from England or one of the British Isles, but this is the way they were able to designate who is educated and upper class and who is not educated and lower class. Same thing with how we wear our clothes, how we discuss certain things or don't discuss certain things. It's all based on this idea of separating status or class. So, moving on to Mexican culture, the Mexican national character and values are evident in dichos, which is your popular sayings, proverbios, your proverbs, and adagios, or adages, and refrains, or refrain, and provide an avenue for exploring the attributes most respected and relevant in Mexican popular culture. Examination of these verbally transmitted traditional values offer an excellent means of learning about another culture, because these often repeated sayings bring together the past, the present, and the future. These sayings focus our attention on basic principles accepted within the culture. While some of these popular sayings are uniquely Mexican, many more of them were brought to Mexico by Spaniards after 1519. Therefore, they reflect the fusion of cultures, especially Castilian and Muslim, found in recently reconquered and unified early 16th century Spain. Although some sayings are culturally unique and others universal, our purpose here is to focus on specific Mexican sayings that reflect some of the values of that culture. Popular sayings, or dichos, reflect many of the basic values of contemporary Mexican society. Yolanda Nava writes, "Dichos feel good on the tongue. They are, after all, a verbal shorthand which elders used countless times to remind one to behave wisely. Dichos may be nuggets of wisdom gained through centuries of experience. They are one form of transmitting folk wisdom. Among the Aztecs, it was proper practice to refer to an older person as my dear young one, much as a Mexican mother today may call her toddler my dear father, mia papito." These expressions reflect some of the central values in Mexican popular culture, including a cheerful acceptance of the will of God, the need to place trust with great care, the significance of appearances, the necessity to guard one's privacy and not breach that of others, your prescribed gender role, having a communal or community spirit, and the importance of family. So I'm going to skip pronouncing a lot of the Mexican phrases only because I cannot master the type of ways to express this information. So rather than butcher a language, I'm just going to go with the English versions. So there is no bad that good does not accompany. In other words, it's always God's will. And Mexican people seem to relish the challenge of finding happiness in the face of adversity. Some of the most frequently heard proverbs reflect that optimism. Better to laugh than to cry. If one laughs at adversity, whether that is a simple upset of plans or that which is most inevitable, death, then there is nothing that can disturb one's happiness. Man proposes and God disposes. Few Mexican women would dare to make plans, whether it be a meeting for lunch tomorrow or making plans for a child's future, without adding these words, if God wills, si Dios quiere. It would be presumptuous to think that one could control the future, and it is viewed as being in God's hands alone. No matter how early one rises, the sun will not come up any sooner. So, in other words, you just have to accept what you cannot change. Nothing is accomplished by unnecessary effort. When the poor have money to buy meat, it must be lent. And this, of course, is just a wonderfully ironic sensibility. The poor must accept that when they have money, it will be time for fasting, i.e., during Lent. Good, devout Catholics will refrain from eating meat. In other words, the poor must accept the beans and rice God provides. The poor are poor because God has deemed them to be poor. And so consequently, they must be satisfied with their lot in life, which goes against everything we are taught as Americans, that you should go out and forge your own path. Finally, he who sings frightens away his grief. By singing, the individual can dispel sadness and drive away gloom. Singing and other forms of music accompany most private Mexican gatherings, but can also be heard on street corners of metropolitan centers. So the idea, again, is you can't control it, you should just deal with it, and music will help you manage your emotions. Then there is the need to trust sparingly. First phrase is there is danger in trust. For the Mexican to place trust in another, particularly anyone who is not a blood relative, is a very high honor. Trust also kills. Betrayal of trust kills the spirit as surely as a bullet might kill the body, and the betrayal of trust would be the gravest ill that one friend could commit against another. Do not trust a reconciled friend, nor a dish twice cooked. If a trust has been betrayed, the lost trust can never be recovered. So, in other words, when you are looking at a scenario where you have trusted someone and they betrayed you and then you made up, don't ever trust them again. And if you look over there on the right hand side, you'll see a picture of two friends embracing, one with a bow and a quiver full of arrows, and the other one with a bunch of arrows in his back. So clearly, once bitten, never do it again. Then the next one is from said to done, there is a great gap. One should not trust the promises will be fulfilled. Even with the best of intentions, circumstances intervene. Thus, one should always be prepared to accept less than is promised, thereby avoiding disappointment. And this goes back to it's God's will. Then finally, the musician who has been paid plays bad music. The more foolish act that an employer could commit would be to pay a worker before the task is completed. One of the first lessons to be learned when interacting with Mexican culture is that easy trust is not valued. Trust must be earned. Reserving payment until the work is completed is viewed as prudent and necessary. Another aspect is the importance of appearances. Tell me with whom you associate, i.e., walk or travel, and I will tell you who you are. So, in other words, who you choose as companions and associates reflects who you are, your quality. One who goes around with wolves learns to howl. So if you run with the wolves, you will learn their wild ways. Therefore, one should avoid such savages and strive to associate with cultured society. One must choose associates with great care. They not only reflect one's position, but they also influence one's character. So, that thing your mom would always say is, you got to be careful who your friends are. Well, this is where the perception of how with whom you hang out with really defines who you are. A good rooster can crow anywhere. Quality is quality no matter the circumstance. A person of true character will show that character in all circumstances, but a person of poor character will not be able to measure up in difficult circumstances. So, in other words, if you are focused on status, the Mexicans have a very high opinion of status. and they want you to appear to be of equally high status. Another important part of the Mexican communication and culture is the respect for privacy. Don't meddle in others' affairs, don't start trouble. So if you stir up the water, then it'll be undrinkable for everyone. So let everyone tend to their own problems and thus avoid spreading them to others. In other words, keep your mouth shut and don't stir the pot. It is good to give advice, but it is better to solve the problem. If you cannot solve the problem, then refrain from giving advice. If you tell the truth, you do not sin, but you don't know the troubles you cause, so keep your own counsel. There are times when the truth is better left unsaid. You know, your mom or your husband or your wife or whomever says, "Honey, does my butt look big in these jeans?" The answer is always no. It could look like the Empire State Building of butts, and you still want to say no because otherwise it's going to hurt them. Finally, flies do not enter a closed mouth. If you keep your mouth shut, then you will not have to worry about putting your foot in it. Gender roles. In a society in which women are viewed as weak and vulnerable, a single woman must justify their unmarried state so that women most often cite the refrain that it is better to be single than to have an unbearable spouse. Neither all your love nor all your money. So if you're a horrible man, it doesn't matter how desperate she is to marry, it's not going to be you. A real Mexican male must maintain control of his household. Sad is the house where the chicken crows and the rooster is quiet. And so culturally, what they're saying is the proper role for a man is the master of his house, and the woman should keep her mouth shut, which obviously in today's modern era has become more of a older generation cultural thing. But the younger people in the culture are still dealing with these issues. They're still trying to break free of these traditions. And then communalism, much help, little work. So when there are many hands working together, it is a little work for all of them. Life without friends, death without mourners at your funeral. So if you don't have friends in life, you're going to die alone. And that is, again, this reinforcing the idea of having a community that you are a part of. Then family, the Mexican family is extended but still very close. When an individual needs help, the family is expected to supply it. Where are you going that you are worth more? Where will you be more valued than at home? The understanding is that you are always better off at home. The love of mother or father, everything else is air. Compared to your mom or dad's love, there is nothing else important. Now, obviously, when we, get married or and have our own kids, that is going to shift to the next generation. So these popular sayings reflect the basic cultural values. They do not even require literacy because they transmit the values orally to all who hear them. They metaphorically condense timeless lessons into readily recalled phrases. These are called sayings or adages that you can really perceive some of the culture's more significant values. So just finding out the idioms, and those are the cultural sayings in a nice big word, the idioms of a culture will tell you about the culture. So, as we go through this process of looking at other cultures, don't discount even the most minute part of the culture, and to really value the cultural idioms that will tell you who the Americans are, or who the Mexicans are, or who the Russians are, or who the Israelis are. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please email or text message your instructor. If you do not attend our college but still have a question, please feel free to leave a comment and we will respond as soon as we can. Thank you and have a fabulous day.